this. Okay. Hello, my name's Lee Dodds. I'm Data Infrastructure Program Lead at the Open Data Institute. So I've been working with open data and linked data for about 10 years or so in different capacities. So thinking about what the most exciting thing around linked data?
Most exciting thing. So I know that there was a recent anniversary that may have passed certain people that maybe aren't so involved in this space. 10 years of linked open data, was it? There's quite a few iterations of the cloud. Has there been a particular highlight over that time for you? Maybe a particular node on the cloud or something else?
Well, I've been responsible for a few nodes on the cloud. Some are no longer there. So I think for me, the thing that I first got me into open data and linked data was the kind of work that youre are doing. That exposing that kind of cultural heritage data in a kind of rich way online. I was also really excited with the work that the BBC were doing around linked data, although unfortunately most of that has now disappeared. So I think my key challenge at the moment is that it feels a little bit like the momentum has dropped around linked open data specifically. There's not much to single out over the last few years in terms of sustained growth. But on the other hand, we can point to graph databases becoming mainstream. We can point to large organizations building knowledge graphs. We can say now that it's pretty uncontroversial to use HTTP URIs to identify things. So in terms of ongoing progress towards the web of data, we're making great strides forward, but I think the challenge is we aren't necessarily using the technology stack that we thought we might be, particularly on the open data space.
Is this one working too?
Yeah.
I'm Chris Guttridge from the University of Southampton. I first used RDF because a researcher at the University of Southampton said it was too hard for me and I wouldn't understand it. As a dear friend still, for some reason. And I've worked with the experts in it who've been working with it from the start, and I'm their webmaster, I'm their techie, so I'm trying to make it useful. And my first experience of creating a live site with RDF was that I did everything, I read all the documentation, I put it up, and then 3 months later a postgrad told me I'd made several errors in my vocabularies, which I dutifully fixed and no one ever looked at it again. And so these days we've got a lot of value out of using RDF to combine data sets from different parts of the organization, to use Sparkle to generate queries across this different bits of open data and actually provide value to our end users. But the other day, the same person came by to thank our linked data specialist. This is 10 years later nearly, and he said, thank you, your website's doing all the correct redirections and everything, and I need it for teaching to show best practice, but no one else is doing it. And I'm suspicious that there's a lot of things that are in the best practice of what we're telling you to do that don't actually provide any demonstrable return on investment, and the one that makes me very, very suspicious, don't tell Sir Tim I said this, but I think resolvable URIs aren't the right solution for computers to make a web of data. Lee said we've got big strides to the web of data. We haven't. We've got a big stride to organizational graphs of data. We were hearing about the brilliant stuff that Elsevier are doing, but I can't link my Elsevier data to another data source. It's not a web of data, it's graphs of data. And we haven't yet made the jump to making information sources useful for computers. Yet.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Sebastian Hellmann. I started working at AKSW in Leipzig about 8 years ago. Back then we had this Lattice project together with Chris Bitzer in Berlin. And so the original creators of the cloud, Anja Jentsch and Richard Ziganiak, they visited us frequently in Leipzig, and we also went to Berlin. So we kind of like saw this cloud growing up, also pushed partly by the project. And then, so both of our labs, we had a lot of PhD students, and it was kind of like a bit of a thing that each PhD student would make a bubble or two by converting some data set and linking it and then hosting it on an AKSW server. So this was kind of like good and bad, because then there was more data available, more linked data, but after the PhD thesis was done, the data was not maintained anymore, and also never updated. So the problem here is like this global quality control, right? So you can make this image, it's a nice marketing thing, but doing the quality control is very hard on this web scale thing. Overall, the World Wide Web was very successful with this publish and link methodology, but for the web of data, it falls kind of like short. And so kind of like the thing that is really missing is that you have clear incentives for publishing linked data. And in this respect, we need to really discuss and find new models for this, especially feedback mechanisms between the different data providers. And I think if these incentive mechanisms are solved, so they're not necessary for the World Wide Web, but they're necessary for the web of data. And if these incentive models are solved, then I think this will scale and take off really good.
Hi, my name is Chris Taggart. I'm co-founder and CEO of Open Corporates. Actually, I'm on this mic, I think, maybe. So I spoke earlier, including quite a lot about the sustainability issue. I've been getting my hands dirty with linked data for probably around about 7 or 8 years, and like many people, probably like Chris to an extent, my first encounter was when you start having to create ontologies. Like you can't just hack somebody else's. If you have to go straight into the deep end and create ontologies and make mistakes and get told you're doing it wrong and things like that. So I had to do one around election data. And local data and other things. I think Lee put it. Well, I think we're all saying the same thing, which is that a lot of the thinking has become has been adopted. You know, whether it's URIs or the clarity about what we're talking about, and you know, I think a lot of the adoption of graphs, you know, and I kind of think of triple stores as kind of graph stores anyhow, has been in part because of the evangelism and the excitement about linked data to begin with. I think there's most of the problems here. I mean, there are definitely technology problems in terms of getting the technology to scale to the sufficient size that you need to for some big problems. At least they were when I last looked into this in detail about 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe they've been solved now, but they certainly hadn't even been solved for some of the graph databases. But I think a lot of these problems are ones which are not techie problems. They're actually societal problems or the economic problems. You know, so I've had a lot of discussions to do with public benefit projects over the last 2 or 3 years about value transfer. So there's value being, you know, created over here, and there's benefit being created over here, and transferring that value from there to there, and more than that, transferring the remuneration for that value over there is a really hard problem to solve. And I would really like, you know, and I think what would be really great, and I've spoken to really Harvard economists about some of this stuff, and it's not, you know, this is not trivial, and actually it hasn't even been that well studied. The economics of network systems and the economics of modern public benefit systems haven't been that well studied. So this it's not a surprise that we're finding this difficult to navigate and to come up with models. But I think we almost should be taking you know, you get some understanding of what the tech, what tech could be done, and then almost immediately we need to start thinking about incentives and about how systems could work and playing around with these things and doing the fail fast and move on approach, because I think there was a lot of my criticism of a lot of the evangelism of 8-10 years ago was that we imagined a system, like a technical system, but without imagining an ecosystem or a social system there as well. And I think that's been the big problem.
That's great. I guess one of the topics that's come up quite a few, or one of the points that's come up quite a few times today is in terms of making this data accessible to a wider audience. Quite a few of the speakers have talked about going down more of the JSON linked data over REST route, given developers tend to be more familiar with REST APIs. Is that a valid approach, do you think, or are there any compromises for adopting that type of approach?
So I think it makes a lot of sense to use RESTful APIs. Use the kind of infrastructure that developers are comfortable working with. I'm a big fan of JSON LD because I think it's a nice sweet spot in terms of being able to provide data in a structured way that is easy to interpret if you're not interested in all of the kind of semantics behind it, but it's all there if you want to dip into it, if you want to use it in more of a kind of RDF kind of graph-based model. So I think I think focusing on that is a good thing. Also, just from some of the other issues that come up in other talks about the ability to scale Sparkle endpoints and other kind of more open ways to access data, whereas a RESTful interface is more constrained. It's easy to scale, it's easy to optimize, but it's also easier to understand from a developer. Despite the fact I've done quite a bit with Sparkle, I'd much sooner have a REST endpoint that I can start to use than starting with an empty text box where I've got to put a Sparkle query in, because as other people have highlighted, I've got to go away and read all the data model documentation first before I can do something. Whereas with REST API, I can put something into my browser and I get some data and I'm instantly doing something, as opposed to spending an hour kind of learning somebody else's data model.
This reminds me of a conversation I was having recently on Facebook with someone who's a friend of a friend who he believes everything opposite to me, which is a good person to talk to, and he hates REST and wants web services. He wants an absolute guarantee of what he's getting back. And this is all about tool chains. And most of the early adopters like REST because the REST tool chain is fun and it's easy and you get started fast. And I wonder if in some ways we should be worrying about the more corporate programmers and making things that would actually work for corporate programmers. But for me, what I do want to happen is when I resolve something over the web with a piece of software, I want to know what I'm getting back. I don't want to go to a link and know it might be RDF, it might be a gigabyte, it might be nothing, it might be encoded in 10 different ways. It's not helpful, and I think that's one of the things that is missing in linked data, is knowing what happens when you go to a link. It's resource intensive to ask for that link. It's very resource intensive to ask for 100 links. So I need to know that's value to my software or to the user looking at it before I resolve it. And that's something we could do easily by conventions to do it, but we don't have publishing patterns to say, this will give you the details of an event at Connected Data London conforming to the Austrian event schema standard or something. There's something that I actually know, oh, my software understands that, it's worth getting. And I think that's what, as a developer, I need beyond REST.
Yeah, but you're actually requiring the server to do what is the work of the client, right? I mean, so I think it's pretty. I mean, the technology, from my perspective, most of the technologically issues are solved. Like we have 20 standards now, JSON LD and Shackle and OWL2 and everything, and the Sparkle stores, they scale. You just have to add more servers, right? So, But here, I mean, if you go to programmable web or another source, I mean, then you have like 20,000 JSON APIs, and you don't have, I mean, okay, now there's some standardization going on with JSON, I think, as well. JSON schema and other things, but in the end you have to investigate the 20,000 APIs and you don't even know what to get, because JSON is a very flexible format, right? You can encode the data in many ways, and there you have to kind of like discover and trust the contract with the web service really manually. With the RDF, at least you know how the data is structured, no matter which format it comes out.
I kind of think I don't really care, honestly, in a way. It's just like the thing is that if the value, if there's enough value, I think people will, it's that cost benefit, right? So I'll go through hell and high water if there's something at the end of it that's worth it, and I won't even get out of bed if it's not worth it. I remember. And back in the early days of open data, when I was doing a local data site, and I had to deal with not just my first SOAP API, but it was the Ordnance Surveys SOAP API, which I don't know how many classes it had, like 200 or classes or whatever, which wouldn't load in and wouldn't validate in the Ruby libraries or any of this sort of stuff. And I remember Tom Loosemore coming to me at an event. I hadn't really met him before, and he just said, "I want to say congratulations." And I thought he was congratulating me on the site that we'd built and so on. And it was just like, "You're the only person I know has ever, it wasn't their job, if it wasn't their job, the only person whose job it wasn't to do this, who's actually managed to get the ONS API to work." And it's like, and they did it because actually it was a key part of what we needed at that stage. I've dealt with, though you can just fire something to it, but actually the truth is that you always want to know about what you're going to get. You need to know a bit about the domain if you're going to build something useful for it. So I don't really mind what we deal with. And similarly, in terms of what we make available and what work we do, we'll do whatever is necessary in order to get people to be, adopt it and to take it up. So I would always be focusing on the incentives. The reason why people have, a company, like, I don't know, Amazon or something did open APIs to begin with, was they just wanted people to be using them. And so I think those classic business things almost about getting adoption, getting the word out there, making it worthwhile for people to do something, is always going to beat the technology issues. The technology could be a friction, it could be a difficulty and so on, but you've still got to think about how do you get it out there? Why is somebody going to care about that? Is the data good enough? Is the data going to be maintained? Will people be able to do something on this? All of those sorts of questions are going to beat the technical thing. I mean, personally, I like JSON, but I don't care that much about it.
We throw it out to the audience at this point for questions.
The thing I want to say on that, which is
Okay.
by making the technology more standard, that if everyone providing corporate information in many countries all conform to the same standard, it would lower the costs.
Absolutely.
And I think that's quite important. That at the moment, it's massively painful to do, and often the reason people aren't doing things in a standard way is not that they don't want to, it's just there's no communication to even have a de facto standard, or not invented here syndrome.
Yeah, I think it's less about the that no one's thought about it, because there have been lots of standards done around company data. There's FIBO, there's there's ISO 20022 and various other things. EU ones. I think they're not invented here is true. I think the other difficulties are ones that actually many of the registers, some of them are the same technology that they were 20 years ago, and they're locked into contracts, and the cost of making any change is incredibly expensive, So there's also, like, again, structural reasons. And finally, actually mapping something, your internal laws, it's what you're talking about with something like a company, the internal laws, mapping that to a standardized thing is very much non-trivial and may not be possible in cases as well. So I think there are other reasons, definitely not inventive is one of them, though. I agree.
Yeah, I would say I would say it lacks. I mean, if they didn't do it, then it lacks. They lack incentive to do it, right? It kind of like also means that, yeah, maybe okay. Actually they have users, I'm sure, but they kind of like they wouldn't have a benefit to adhere to a standard. Otherwise, they would have done it already. So for the web, it works because you want to get indexed in Google, for example. So they have clear incentives. I think that the linked data community was very idealistic, you know. Also, there were a lot of evangelists, and then, of course, on the other side, you have the people who are only focused on technology. So they probably don't care what they build. I mean, the main important thing is that it's an awesome technology or something like that. But now I think we should shift this and be like very economic, right? Have an economic mindset and create also incentives to adhere to standards.
I would tweet that if I wasn't on the panel.
Okay. On that note, questions from the audience? One at the back.
In the case of company data.
Sebastian, you raised a good point there with. You mentioned a good point about the community being idealistic and also bringing in the economic factors. When that happens, what do we do about the other guys, the ones who aren't idealistic, who want to, malicious actors, basically? What do we do about those? Because I could see with a situation like that, you could easily put something up. You could poison a network. You can make things go wrong. What's the kind of protections in those ways?
I have some of that. Data.totl.net, I have malicious data sets. I've got Daily Mail causes of cancer for you.
Can you give me, when you're talking about bad actors, what sort of thing?
Can you make
Give me an example.
Sorry, I'm just thinking.
To the web?
Well, yes. The moment that we have something where there's economic value in having it disrupted or responded in fake news as
things like slanderous content on
yes,
Wikipedia that's being extracted into
or even
other sources.
A valid system which is compromised in some way, which then there is value in manipulating that data to present something that isn't true. You've got a source of truth. If there's somebody who can come in and say, oh well, let's just hack that, let's change what's publicly available and then make that say something different.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
how do we protect against that?
I mean, I think, obviously that's part of this is why, part of the appeal of blockchain DLT stuff that's coming in. And I'm sort of surprised that there hasn't been more discussion of that, because there's many similarities in between some of the issues here as well. We created, when we launched Open Corporates, or maybe like within a few months after launching Open Corporates, we created dereferenceable URIs for them, and all our identifiers are completely open. We have no IP in our identifiers, and we do have people linking to them and so on. But one of the things that essentially a company record in Open Corporates has is it has the provenance, but it's also very clear about what it is. Now, actually, that was in theory great from a linked data point of view. It's certainly great from an end user point of view. Many of whom our biggest customers have quarterly flat file CSV dumps. Because that's what they're used to, and that's what their ETL systems can handle. But that's also, we're now getting an increasing number of inquiries from people using distributed ledger technology, blockchain, something of that sort of stuff. Because when you have something like that, you need that clarity and you need that provenance. and so I think there's a lot of similarities around almost like use cases or needs around some of these different things. There's also other similarities in terms of the things like the infancy of the technology and the difficulty of scale and some of the cost that's involved in creating some of these systems as well. I haven't been following this area enough to know whether there's been a lot of work in terms of the intersection of those things. But I think as we get into, the clear thing is as you start combining things together, and particularly combining things that you didn't create, you didn't own, then there's always that question of how much do you trust that? And that's true in an old-fashioned system in terms of having a data set that you ingested, and it's true now. In a sense, the bigger issue, and this is again there in graph technology, in linked data, and in DLT, which is the ability to walk. And if you walk down this path and it's going down an untrusted path, then you can end up in a bad place. So I think there's some, but I don't know enough about how people in the linked data world have been interacting with the DLT world.
Well, I can't answer that question, but I can just maybe expand a little bit on what you were saying there. So both trust and quality are contextual. It depends on what you're doing. So some of the issues that you mentioned depend on the type of data source you're using. So the ways that quality or trust can be impacted on things like Wikipedia, Wikidata, OpenStreetMap is very different to the ways it might be impacted with, say, data you're getting from Transport for London, where you would assume that there is a certain amount of security, data security, information security that they're putting in place. So you have a choice about where you're getting your data from, so that as a consumer you're not being forced to take malicious data. So we need to understand that the provenance of the data sources we're collecting, and that's particularly important for intermediaries. So it's great to hear what you're doing on Open Corporates and about giving that transparency, because as we end up with more data on the web, there will be more intermediaries offering value-added services for particular sectors. So that kind of trust and transparency is going to be even more important. But I feel like it's an issue that we're having to deal with now, because we're kind of drowning in fake news and disinformation.
This is something we've considered a few years ago. We run a Sparkle endpoint for my university, which takes a bunch of data sets we produce. And it occurred to us one of those data sets is effectively we're taking some RDF from a student society. And the students can put any data they want into that. They don't have to get restricted to making statements about Wi-Fi nodes provided by their society. They could put a label in for anything in the organisation. And we have currently no sanitisation on it. We've stopped them doing that instead. But if you take raw graph data into your graph, it's extremely vulnerable because it doesn't just affect the bits that you're importing, it could affect any part of the graph. And sort of triple injection is, for a long time, been something I've been desperately hoping to see in the news. Because we've succeeded when we're popular enough that it's worth paying some hacker in China to do it. And we don't see that much yet. But there are ways to sanitize it, but I'm quite frustrated we're not successful enough in open links data to have people producing malicious RDF. This is why I produced the site I just mentioned, data.totl.net. There's a whole section on there of malicious RDF. There's one that's an ontology that declares 400 different URIs for people called David and Dave are the same person. And there's a few other examples of just things that you don't want to trust. One post, I think it might have been Richard or someone like that, was trying to download one of them and went, how big is this data set of music? It's really big. I'm like, oh, it's just randomly generated. It's like, what? I've got to record several million, and it's oh God. And I've tried to make some data sets that are there that if you're doing something to sanitize data sets, they should set off all the alarm bells and you should delete them. So the idea of those were something as a deliberate bad actors for people to play with. And no one's ever used that. They use the playing cards ontology for teaching, but that's about all so far.
One more question over there.
Do you think the web should be more distributed than it is? And does linked data help achieve that? Maybe we could be running social networks on triple stores on our smartphones and stuff like that.
That's the dream, isn't it? There was a project at based around MIT called Solid, which was not quite vaporware, but it was beautiful dreaming of the idea of turning web storage like Dropbox into a commodity service like email, while the rest of the world is busy moving to Gmail because they can't be bothered to use their ISP's own email service. And again, these have to be incentivized, and most people would rather have centralized services that give them a bit of extra benefit than distribution. Unless we can incentivize and make people feel the value of distribution, we're not going to get it. They don't care about privacy from anyone but their mates. People care about their mates seeing what they're browsing on the web, but they don't really care about what the government sees them do. You know, they say they do, but not enough to change behavior.
I sort of take the view that, it massively disturbs me how centralized we're becoming. You know, the idea that the internet, and I've been on the internet for, I don't know, well, I was on the source before the internet, and, you know, various others, and bulletin boards and all this sort of stuff. And there's the ideas about it being decentralized and so on. I don't think we've ever done anything in humankind that's been as centralized as we are. You know, go back to the 20s, and you need to be someone like Randolph Hearst to own printing presses in San Francisco and to dominate society there. The amount of capital required to go to a printing press, you know, to buy a printing press and to build a distribution system was enormous. But it was nothing like the amount of it is to build huge server farms to do on-the-fly translation, for example. And so we're building these incredible, there's the concept of data gravity as well, that the more data you've got, this tiny data set's worth nothing to everyone else because you need all these other data sets to make it worthwhile. Almost everything we're doing from particularly around data, it's becoming centralized. The businesses are becoming centralized. Uber is fundamentally an attempt to replace lots of little local monopolies, which many taxi companies were, and taxi companies are not, wonderful idealistic things. In many countries, they're associated with organized crime as well. But you're creating they want to replace all of these little local monopolies with one global monopoly. And I think, the fact that we are connecting through these things, I'd be really interesting what happens if we could ever manage to get peer-to-peer networks off the ground and those sorts of things. But I think my fear about the world is that because of the network does one thing, the pervading or the central idea behind the network is about reducing friction. And friction has been an essential part of our society for many years, and it's why it's hard to pass laws. It's why competition exists to a certain extent. And I think that this centralization, that the reduction of friction brings, is highly problematic. The more people we can have, what's really critical to have a fair, pluralistic society is different people, different actors with different interests, different incentives, sometimes coming together, sometimes not coming together. But that's increasingly, getting further away from where we are at the moment. So it makes me deeply concerned, these sorts of things. I don't think making data on the web is going to solve things, because with all these other things, it would be, it's like it's a drop in the ocean. But I'm sure that that's another area where we have to be decentralized, where we have to be distributed, where we have to have, and we have to have differing opinions as well. Dissent.
Yeah. So I have to agree and disagree. So the decentralization is getting less. I agree, and there are some bad parts about this. Also, large companies accumulating data with us as the product, kind of in the sense, and we all use it because it's a very practical service and things like that. But I think there's also a chance in centralization for data, because Yeah, if you let's say, I mean, data is a great transparency tool as well. So if we make this more accessible, even from a centralized, so I mean, in the sense, Google centralizes the web, like it crawls it, and you have one way to access it. Okay, Yahoo does the same, and Bing and everybody. But if we manage to have this for data, let's say you could access all the data and all the sources that are available, you would be suddenly suddenly enabled to reach a level of transparency that you hadn't before. So, and this would make a lot of people more equal because they could get informed better.
I would just say that transparency and centralization of data are orthogonal. I really don't see that the two are, are linked in any way. In fact, the tendency is because it costs so much money to centralize the data, and there's a drive to and people have to put up money for that, whether it's VCs or whoever. Then you tend to the greater centralization, the less transparent it is.
Sadly, I think the thing that will sort this out for us is probably a major war. It's something that when I was reviewing an ID system called ORCID for identifying researchers worldwide, it's based on servers in Texas, and one of the key concerns I have is what happens if the EU ends up in the next 100 years at war with America, and our ID schemes are based around something that we can't fork and then rejoin. Ideally, we want systems that can be split and then re-merged once we're all friends again, but hopefully. But generally, what would happen if the EU goes to war with America or one of the other first world nations? What happens to Google? What happens to our services? What happens to Amazon? We haven't got a clue. Hopefully, it'll be so much bother that we won't go to war.
There we go, linked data, a force for peace.
So just briefly to help answer that question, there's some really interesting technologies around the kind of decentralization movement. So that I think could be worth exploring for open data specifically. So hello, yeah, okay. So IPFS, for example, I think this could be really interesting to help distribute particularly public domain and openly licensed data to spread around IP file system. It's a kind of distributed protocol for hosting and accessing data and information. So it's a good way to kind of share around the hosting of those kind of resources, which I think is really good to address some of these kind of longevity issues. But just to pick up on what Sebastian was saying, the thing that I'm frustrated about at the moment is there is so much data that's out there on the web, but only Google have the capacity to access it. Part of the vision around linked data was that we were going to follow our nose, we were going to all going to aggregate and harvest the data that we needed. But in practice, that's not actually possible. Not if you want that data in a timely fashion. And the thing that I've always been surprised at is that there aren't any intermediaries that have sprung up to address that specific issue of just providing feeds of regularly updated access to crawled data to organisations. So that feels
I've tried.
Yeah, I'm sure people have. It's just it feels like just a big piece of the puzzle that we haven't really kind of addressed.
We did an experimental service which works, which auto-discovers open data from UK universities about research equipment. Every week it looks at every university homepage, or in fact every AC UK homepage, and looks for a hidden link in it to a RDF document that says, here's our organisation, like a homepage, like a bit like a FOF profile for an organisation. You heard of FOF? But with information on the equipment data, usually just a CSV file with enough information to tell us we can consume it. That works. 40 or so organisations have discoverable data like that. I thought that would be enough of a tipping point to prove the technology, but it wasn't. What was nice was lots of universities also put in extra information, because writing a text file is easy once they've got permission to do it. And lots of them put in links to their social media accounts and links to their key pages. We gave an ontology that allowed them to describe, this is our search page, this is our freedom of information page. So there's actually on opd.data.ac.uk pages which list all of those key pages for different universities. And it's such a lovely demo, and it just hasn't caught on beyond that. I thought, that's enough. I will have pushed the technology far enough. The Russell Group are doing it. I've won. No. I ran out of steam.
I think we may have to, unfortunately, draw this very lively debate to a close, but we have...
but I want to discuss on. Because, I mean...
We've got this room booked until midnight, so it's actually no problem.
His argument was now that because of the decentralization, we cannot discover any data in an effective way, so there's no transparency. So that's not orthogonality.
No, but the centralization and the I think there's talking about two different things. With the centralization and the costs associated with centralization and transparency, I think are, or if they're not orthogonal, then they're actually pushing different directions. They're on the same things, but they're pulling in. There's a different tension. I think there are practical things, and I come back down to the economics of this, the incentives. It's the things we've all been agreeing on in many ways, which is what are the incentives for doing this? How do we create those incentives? I mean, if I hadn't sold my last business, there's no way we would have done open corporates, because I had enough that I didn't need to worry about getting paid for the first few years.
Thank you for that.
But I think a lot of these things, it is non-trivial to do these things, particularly in a business as usual, to make sure that this is sustainable and that there is a thing, and taking a risk. And one of the reasons why we're doing the work that we're doing on the corporate structure, and we'll be publishing it, we're publishing as we go along, we'll be publishing the articles of association, we'll have that under a license so that anyone can just use them. It is because, in a sense, businesses have got this way of of value being, people taking a risk and having a return. But if you can put that in a box which requires the public benefit as well, then that potentially has some, there may be, and only maybe, there's a way of solving some of these problems. I'm not against idealism. I think idealism is really important to move us forwards. But I do think the fundamental questions are around incentives, the transfer of value and the return on that value, and about how do we create systems that pull together in the public good. So I don't have answers to that. We're playing around with this sort of stuff, but hopefully we can find answers, because I want to live in a world where we can.
I think it's a great note to end on. Big thanks to the panel. I'm not going to be that guy that keeps everyone from their beer or their glass of wine downstairs. So don't worry, this will be quick. But just to try and wrap things up very quickly. I thought that was pretty cool, by the way, and that was one thing that's doing the rounds on Twitter. I think Kingsley created it, but I'm not sure. 10 years of linked open data. Anyway, skipping that. Okay, so to bring Connected Data London 2017 to a close, it'll be very, very quick, because I think the beer is actually running out downstairs, so you will need to be quick as well. So what is connected data about? Well, hopefully people have seen today it's a smorgasbord of technologies for different purposes, different requirements, different objectives. Some commercial objectives, some kind of less tangible societal objectives. But what is connected data? Is it graphs? Is it RDF? Is it NLP? Is it SCOS? It's kind of all and none of those things really. And I guess one of the kind of takeaways maybe that's come from this, really animated last session is, there's a lot of exciting things that are going on, but there's still this big gap between the general kind of data population and, you know, this is still, I guess, a relatively niche group in the data landscape. I think one of the statistics I had in the original intro presentation was that I think Click did a survey recently on data literacy and found that I think it was only 17% of workers felt that they were sufficiently data literate to do their jobs in the modern era, which I think is still pretty astounding. So I guess connected data, yes, absolutely, it's all about pushing these boundaries and pushing these things forward, but it's also about, you know, supporting the guys that are just starting out on this journey. So supporting the guys that, you know, are yet to see the wonders of, you know, converting an indented list into a connected data asset. It's about the guys that, you know, maybe starting out with mind maps and wondering whether they're allowed to do things like connect branches on mind maps. So yeah, on that note, I'd like to close Connected Data London 2017. Big thanks to all the speakers and panelists and sponsors today, and we'll be back for a bigger conference next year, 2018. Thanks everyone for today.